Welcome to Cambridge Forum, discussing The Rose and the Briar with Sean Wilentz and Greil Marcus. I'm Ruth Perry, professor of literature at MIT. We have a lot of questions to ask and a lot of interesting things to listen to. What place do folk ballads hold in American culture? Why do these old songs of jilted lovers and hanging judges, what do they have to say to the 21st century audiences? Our speakers and our panelists are eminently qualified to address these questions, and together they will investigate the ways in which we can understand these elemental songs and explore the insights that ballads give to the American psyche and culture. Sean Wilentz and Greil Marcus are the editors of The Rose and the Briar, Death, Love, and Liberty in the American Ballad, an anthology of essays, reflections, and creative responses to selected American ballads. Sean Wilentz is a professor of history at Princeton University and historian in residence at Bob Dylan's official website. His newest book is The Rise of American Democracy, From Jefferson to Lincoln. Greil Marcus is an acclaimed music critic and original columnist for the Rolling Stone, whose works appear in The Village Voice, Art Forum, and Interview. Among his previous books are Lipstick Traces and Mystery Train. We're very lucky to have with us today Scott Alarik, who is going to perform a few selections of American ballads. Scott is the folk music critic for the Boston Globe and the author of Deep Community. A well-known Boston area musician and singer, Scott is also a member of our discussion panel. Millie Rahn, another one of our panelists, brings her training as a folklorist to the panel. Millie's work includes developing and presenting cultural traditions throughout New England. She has worked as a producer for the Lowell and the National Folk Festival and has conducted extensive research on the folk revival of the 1960s. Bill Nowlin is one of the founders of Rounder Records, another one of our panelists. He has coordinated many of Rounder's most important reissues of traditional music, including the massive and wonderful Alan Lomax collection. Bill joins the panel to speak to the question of the viability of folk music in a market culture. We'll now, I think before we talk about ballads, we have to listen to one. And so Scott Alarik is going to sing for us the Ballad of Barbara Allen.
Yes. This is the ballad from which Greil and Sean took the book title, and it's so old that the first known reference to it in the mid-17th century refers to it as an old familiar ballad. And it's certainly lived as an American folk ballad as long as English or Scottish people have been here. It's called Barbara Allen. 'Twas in the merry month of May, when green buds all were swelling, sweet William on his deathbed lay, for love of Barbara Allen, he sent his servant to the town, to the place where she was dwelling. You must come to my master dear, if your name be Barbara Allen. So slowly, slowly she got up, so slowly she drew nigh him, and the only words to him did say, young man, I think you're dying. He turned his face unto the wall, and the death was in him welling. Goodbye, goodbye to my friends all. Be kind to Barbara Allen. When he was dead and laid to grave, and the death bells over it both long and narrow. Sweet William died for the love of thee, and I shall die of sorrow. Sweet William died on yesterday, and I shall die tomorrow. Barbara Allen was buried in the old churchyard. Sweet William was buried beside her. Out of Sweet William's heart there grew a rose. Out of Barbara Allen's a briar. They grew and they grew in the old churchyard, till they could grow no higher. At the end they formed a true lover's knot, and the rose grew round the briar. The rose grew round the briar.
Thank you, Scott Alarik. Wonderful. It's the ballad that has more variations than any other known ballad, and I love listening to it always. First, before we turn to the panel, let's hear from one of our authors, Sean Wilentz.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me out there? You can't hear me out there. Now you can hear me out there. I'll scrunch. Excuse me. It's been a long day. I hope now you know all over again why we call this book The Rose and the Briar. It's a beautiful song, Barbara Allen, and every time I hear it, it makes me stop, especially when it's sung as nicely as it just was. In fact, a year ago, just about a year ago, wasn't it? In December, yeah. In early December, we had a floor show for this book, and in New York, and Terry Roach sang that song, and I've known my friend Greil here for a long time, but I know he'd never seen me cry, and I don't think I'd ever seen him cry before, and we were both weeping in front of 500 people, and it was really embarrassing. But that's what ballads can do. Ballads can make you weep to the very last tear. Ballads can make you weep that makes you feel limp and still be able to go on. That's one of the things that ballads can do. Why did we want to do this book, though? Let me shift dramatically. A couple of years back, we at Princeton had the great good fortune of Greil being a fellow in the American Studies program, and he actually came back a couple of years later. And there was coincidentally a conference going on about field recordings, a very recondite, folky kind of thing from those of us who know these kinds of things. But, it was very highly specialized knowledge about, what kinds of recorders were used in San Antonio when Robert Johnson actually sang for Don Law, that kind of thing. But also brought together an extraordinary group, not just of critics, but of musicians, including, sadly and very happily, the last performance ever of the trio Kerner, Ray, and Glover, 3 days after the concert. Dave Ray died, but he had to make that gig, and he made it. So really an amazing occasion. And somewhere all in there, Greil and I were talking about ballads, and what there was about the ballad form in particular that seemed to be so powerful in understanding this country. There are ballads from everywhere. Every country, every nation has its ballads. But there was something about the way the ballad form took shape in this country that we thought became an important and probably musically the most important way in which Americans told each other about themselves and about each other. Not just sadly, sometimes joyously, in every possible way. Not just in a standard narrative like the one we just heard, but in all kinds of broken up ways. And the more we talked about it, the smarter Greil got. So I thought, well, let's put a book together about this. And we didn't want to do, and the last thing we wanted to do was write a book ourselves, because we had too busy to do that kind of thing. And we didn't want to do a conventional book of music appreciation or even musical criticism. What we wanted to do was to see how the ballad lived in the lives of writers we admired. So we made up a list of, I don't know, it was 25 people, and something like 24 writers of the 25 came through. The ground rules were simple. They picked the ballads. We did not, we sent a few suggestive hints as to the kinds of things they might do, but they did the ballads. They chose them. We were very much at their mercy. And what we got, I think, is no doubt idiosyncratic, but still in some ways telling view of how the ballad form lives today among a very wide range of extremely talented writers and musicians and some critics who think about these things very deeply. The oldest one is, of course, Briar. But since we're very promiscuous in our definition of what a ballad could be, it goes right through Duke Ellington and someone writing about Mahalia Jackson's version of Come Sunday, which, as many reviewers told us, is not a ballad strictly at all. It's a hymn, but it's also a ballad, as Stanley Crouch points out in his essay and makes the case for. All the way up to Bruce Springsteen's Nebraska, which very much is a ballad. We had no idea what we were going to get. We got everything from cartoons to remade ballads. In fact, the last piece in the book is Paul Muldoon's take on the very famous song Streets of Laredo, which we'll be hearing later on, a well-known song that actually began as a folk song known as the Bard of Armagh. Those of you who know Paul Muldoon's work will know that he is now the Bard of Armagh. That is to say, he's from Armagh. So it was all very fitting and all very wonderful. And he wrote a new ballad. We have all kinds of things in here. But I thought I'd read just a very little bit before I turn off to Greil. One of the more unexpected pieces, or one of the more unexpected pieces of writing, which is about Buddy Bolden's blues. I don't know how many of you know Buddy Bolden's blues. It wasn't a big thing in the folk revival. Well, actually, Don Queskin actually did a version of this at one point, but it's not a standard ballad. It's maybe the founding rock, the keystone of New Orleans jazz. And it's written about by Luke Sant, the very talented, extraordinarily talented critic and writer, who has an ability to wake the dead. He really has an ability to wake the dead. He knows the dead. It's very frightening. And in his piece, he tries to describe what it was like the first time that the enormously talented, that's saying it slightly, that the genius cornet player Buddy Bolden first played Buddy Bolden's blues, because it was made up on the spot. And he describes what it was like in a place called the Union Sons Hall, and of course it was in New Orleans. So in honor of New Orleans, I'm going to read this. But let's get back to the Union Sons Hall. I'm going to say this is a bit blasphemous for a church, but it's okay. I think we can get away with it. I hope so. Let's get back to the Union Sons Hall. It's a Saturday night in July 1902, and the temperature outside is in the lower 90s, with 83% humidity. The hall is typical for its place and function, an open room, maybe 20 by 50 feet, made of white pine that hasn't seen a new coat of paint in a few decades, with no furniture besides a table for a ticket taker and a series of long benches lining the walls, and no decor other than some bits of half-shredded bunting tacked to the molding about 10 feet up. There's a small raised stage at one end with nothing on it but a few chairs, and maybe Tillman's, one of the men in the group, the drums. People start trickling in around 9. They are local people, mostly single and mostly young, teamsters and plasterers and laundresses and stevedores and domestic servants and barbers and sailors and cooks. A few pimps and prostitutes are in the company as well, and a number of persons of no account, bearing names that may write them then mean plenty in the neighborhood, but will be preserved only as marginalia in the police records. Grand Jury, Cinderella, Pudding Man, Hit 'em Quick, Ratty Cake, Lead Pencil, 2 rooms and a kitchen. Someone may be selling glasses of beer from a keg in the corner, but many in attendance will have brought stronger sustenance in pint bottles. Within half an hour, the room is already fetid with cigar smoke. As more and more people crowd in, the heat rises, and the air circulation slows to an ooze, and the air gradually becomes solid, a wall composed of smoke and sweat and beer and rice powder and Florida water and bay rum and musk and farts. That's the scene for the making of Buddy Bolden. That's the kind of writing we got, and we got it because each of these writers, in his or her own way, loves this music and loves it with not just their hearts and their minds, but their imaginations, and brings it all to life in a way that you can't hear even in the greatest performance. It's a different way of hearing these ballads, and that's what we hope we've presented.
Thank you, Sean Wilentz. Now let's welcome our next speaker to the Cambridge Forum, Greil Marcus.
Well, one of the things that I thought about this book was that we had to have musicians in it. We had to have musicians writing in the book. And there were a number of people who seemed to me likely, and in particular John Langford of the Mekons, David Thomas of Per Ubu, Rennie Sparks of the Handsome Family. Per Ubu is a punk band from Cleveland that started in 1975. The Mekons are a punk band from Leeds, England that started in 1977. Both of those bands are still as active and as innovative as they ever were. The Handsome Family is a 2-person folk group. Rennie Sparks writes all the words. Her husband, Brett Sparks, does all the singing, plays all the music. And I went to Rennie Sparks because she writes Gothic ballads, but they're modern Gothic ballads. They're surrealist Gothic ballads when you first hear them, but the more you listen, the older they get. The surrealist tinge has always been present in ballads, the sense of impossibility that's presented as plain fact. In the very ancient ballad Nottingham Town, which has a melody that Bob Dylan took for his song Masters of War, there is a sequence when all kinds of impossible things happen, and they're presented as if it's a story everybody knows. 10,000 were drowned that had never been born is one of the lines. And in fact, Bob Dylan took the cadence, the way the song builds for his song, A Hard Rain's A Gonna Fall. 10,000 were drowned that never were born. One of Rennie Sparks' songs begins with the line, there's a fish in my stomach that's 1,000 years old. And of course that line just immediately throws you back. You say, what are you talking about? And within a verse or two, there's nothing strange about it at all. And it's not a metaphor either. It's not like I have a really bad stomach ache. That's not what he's saying. But what I didn't expect, and what Sean didn't expect from Rennie Sparks, for example, was that out of this sensibility, and she also had written a book of short stories called Evil, which is about little girls being kidnapped and other things that you would find in traditional ballads, that she would produce a 7,000-word, scholarly, deeply researched essay on the ancient British and American ballad Pretty Polly, which is what she came up with, ending with the murder by Richard Speck of 8 nurses in Chicago, and tying this all together so that there is no question whatsoever that what Pretty Polly, which is the story of a young woman who's led to her grave by her erstwhile lover, who kills her in the original form because she's pregnant and he's got to get rid of her, but in the American form, where that information is left out, kills her for the pleasure of doing so. It's a real murder. It doesn't have any justification. It's not utilitarian. David Thomas of Père Ubu, I'd heard lecture, but again, he wrote a theoretical essay about the way recording techniques, as they developed from the time of Edison singing Mary Had a Little Lamb in 1877 to the present, how recording technique had changed the narrative voice of the ballad and changed what, in his phrase, what the ballad wants. His dictum is what the ballad wants, the ballad gets. So he wrote about the wreck of the old 97, which is about a train wreck in the early part of the 20th century, where the engineer loses his life in a heroic manner, even though in fact he was reckless and foolhardy and violated all rules. And it ends with a homily about, women don't ever speak ill to your husband because he may never come back. He may go out one day and never come back. And as David Thomas points out, Steve Brody, the engineer on the old 97, was a bachelor. But the ballad wanted him married, so married he was. There were all kinds of shocks and surprises. John Langford of the Mekons, who was a very good writer, decided not to write. He took the old ballad, The Cuckoo, he rewrote it as an attack on the fatuousness of the American dream, and instead of being about Willie, I'm gonna build a castle so high, I'm gonna build a house so high so I can see Willie when he passes by, which is how The Cuckoo begins. You want, who's Willie? Why are you watching him? Why do you have to build a house just to see him? What if he doesn't pass by? This became a ballad about Slick Willie. And what John Langford did was produce a series of collages where the cuckoo is at the center of each collage, becomes ever more desperate and crazed as the panels go on, until finally the American eagle and the cuckoo are together roasting a wild turkey, which was Benjamin Franklin's choice as national bird. He lost. We were continually surprised and shocked as the various pieces came in. It was never anything that we expected. I think for me, maybe the strongest piece in the whole book is Steve Erickson on Randy Newman's Sail Away in Louisiana, 1927. One is a ballad in which you could only say a publicist, a PR man for the slave trade, arrives in Africa and talks the Africans onto the boat with promises of how fabulous life in America is going to be. In other words, he retails the American dream as if he's perpetrating a real estate scam selling you swampland in Florida. Louisiana 1927 is a ballad about the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 and how a farmer whose whole life has been wiped out by that flood sees it and how he feels it. And he says, they're trying to wipe us away. They're trying to wipe us away. And every Southerner I know who's ever heard that ballad, when the question of who is they trying to wipe us away, every Southerner knows who they are. Every Southerner knows that they are Northerners who would be just as happy to see that whole part of the country wiped away so they can forget that it ever existed, so that the North's complicity with slavery could be forgotten. And Steve Erickson, who's a novelist, builds this entire essay around Lincoln's second inaugural address and the idea of three Americas and the idea of an American original sin and the way in which the con man who talks the Africans onto the slave ship reappears hundreds of years later in the person of a Louisiana farmer whose forebears never owned slaves, never had the money to do so, but whose whole way of life is predicated on the unmarked graves that lie beneath his feet, which are also being washed away. And during the flood that inundated New Orleans in September, I heard an interview with a woman who was stranded on one of the overpasses in New Orleans and had been there for days with hundreds of other people with no food, with no water, with helicopters flying over them again and again and again, just as in Randy Newman's song, President Coolidge flies down to survey the damage. And this woman said, they want us either to die here or they want us to start killing each other. That's what they want. And they, in her words, was also very, very specific, and it meant white people as opposed to black people. But it also meant poor people, and it also meant people in New Orleans who are never supposed to show their faces to tourists. So, the question of what the ballad's place in our world today in some ways is self-evident. The ballad is a way for people to tell stories about things that aren't supposed to be talked about, aren't supposed to be thought about, and aren't supposed to be felt. You place it in the context of a story, and you pretend that it's about somebody else, and then you write it or you perform it in such a way that ultimately will suck the listener in and expose his or her complicity. That's one part of what the ballad does and has always done. Another thing it does, though, is that it insists that there are things in human nature, there are things, particularly in the United States, where every person is granted certain promises and the burden of living up to them, such as the promise of liberty, which means that you are responsible for yourself and that you aren't permitted to blame anyone else for your circumstances. Often, your circumstances are incomprehensible. They make no sense if you try simply to explain them as a result of your own actions. And so the ballad puts a sense of mystery, of the unexplainable, back into everyday life and tells you that people have had to live with that burden and will always live with that burden. And particularly when people are mandated to live up to a dream that they never asked to have in the first place, that's something that's necessary. And it's also a tradition that can't die, that has no reason to die. As Bob Dylan once said in 1965, I think it was, he said, all the folk music people, they're always thinking about protecting and preserving. And he said, this music doesn't need to be protected. Death is a fact. You can't be protected from death. In other words, he's saying the ballad is always about death. And it's always about the mystery of death and how we will confront the deaths of people around us and how we'll contemplate our own.
Thank you, Greil Marcus. You're joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to Sean Wilentz and Greil Marcus discussing The Rose and the Briar. Before we turn to the panel, let's have another ballad. This one is being sung to us by Scott Alarik, and it is The Streets of Laredo.
Well, in the folk world, you have to know that any time you hear a sentence that mentions death 3-4 times, you're talking song cue. This is a ballad that Greil talks about in his essay in the book. And I think if you take it a step, see it as sort of a step more American and a step more modern than Barbara Allen, I think you can begin to trace a little of what America does with the ballad form, how it begins to change it. One of the things that happens to ballads, and a lot of other folk songs, when they get over here, they lose a lot of their idiomatic ethnicity as they become songs that everybody can share and everybody can sing together. Another thing that happens in this ballad, Streets of Laredo, is that mysterious details are left out. In Barbara Allen, you've got a pretty straight-ahead story being told, beginning, middle, end, coda, theme, you know. In this ballad, which is based on Bard of Armagh, as Sean said, but also based on a sailor's cautionary ballad of a guy who dies of syphilis called The Unfortunate Rake. And it's a very straight-ahead ballad, and the lesson is, you know, don't be a rake or you'll be unfortunate. In Streets of Laredo, we never find out what happens to it's also known as the dying cowboy's last request. We never know what happened to him, whether he had it coming, whether it was an accident, whether he's shot, but we don't know why, which tends to turn the focus of the ballad somewhere else. And I think what the person who wrote this ballad is more concerned with, as Greil was saying, is how we confront death. So that the very artfully and very impressionistically, years before the term impressionism was coined, the author of this ballad is turning the focus from the dying cowboy onto us and how we confront death and what we do in the presence of death.
As I walked out in the streets of Laredo, I walked out in Laredo one day. I spied a young cowboy all draped in white linen, cold as the clay. I see by your outfit that you are a cowboy. These words he did say as I boldly stepped by. Come sit down beside me and hear my sad story. I'm shot in the breast and I know I must die. 'Twas once in the saddle I used to go dashing. Once in the saddle I used to go gay. First to the alehouse, then to the jailhouse. I'm shot in the breast and I'm dying today. Oh, beat the drum slowly, play the fife slowly, play the dead march as you carry me along. Take me to green valleys, there lay the sod o'er me, for I'm a young cowboy and I know I've done wrong. Now fetch me some water, a cup of cold water to cool my parched lips, the cowboy then said. But before I returned, his soul had departed, gone to his maker, the cowboy was dead. Oh, beat the drum slowly, play the fife slowly, play the dead march as you carry me along. Take me to green valleys, there lay the sod o'er me, for I'm a young cowboy and I know I've done wrong. I'm a young cowboy and I know I've done wrong.
Thank you, Scott Alarik. It's been said that that accompanying singing is a particularly American performance art, and that ballads are often sung unaccompanied in England and Scotland. So that was absolutely appropriate. Wonderful. I'd like to invite the panel now to open the discussion with Sean and Greil. Just a reminder to our panelists, please identify yourself for our listening audience before making your question or comment. Let's start with Millie Rahn, who looks at the ballad from the viewpoint of the folk tradition. Millie.
Thank you. I should say the role of the folklorist is to contextualize and base our context on ethnography, and I kind of look at this book as if I was going out in the field to do a fieldwork project. So I will let you in on some of my thought processes along the way. I think it's a very central part of human nature, to this urge to traditionalize. We really want to tell our stories. We want to talk about who we are. And some of the things that Greil was saying about talking about things that aren't taboo. A lot of these ballads talk in the language of cautionary tales. They talk about mythic, what we in the business say tale roles. You think of a ballad, you've got the hero, you've got the anti-hero, you've got the change agent, things like that. Kind of a more recent version that a lot of people are aware of we call them contemporary legends, they're called urban legends. They're kind of the distilled version of a lot of this folk knowledge. Don't go into the woods with a young man who you just met, especially if there's a stream nearby, things like that. That's the kind of knowledge, that's the way people communicated for a long time. And in many ways, that's still how we communicate. One of the other things that I was struck by, a lot of the people in their very marvelous impressions on this take on ballads in America, they talk about things have to be old, or they have to they have to be written by somebody who's not identified. Well, I mark my words, Louisiana 1927 is going to enter tradition, especially after this year. Think about after the recent hurricanes and how many newspapers and magazines and websites were quoting from that song, which picks up on some earlier songs that talked about the flood. There's something here about, this incredible determination to tell our stories, and we find it in every folk group, any community we go in and talk to. A lot of these songs, like we were saying, might not have been accompanied, but they were sung in the kitchen, or they were sung where people were working. We have to remember that we are children of the technology age, and even though when I think of most of the people writing in here, it's very much a boomer's conversation. And we were the generation, and looking at people here in the audience, for most of us, we grew up on John Wayne movies and cowboy shows on Saturday morning, and we listened to records, and, we all heard Bob Dylan sing, and many people, I would venture to say here, heard Joan Baez singing down the street at Club 47, Barbary Allen. And what comes next? As a folklorist, I can also assure you that, as we hear all the time, that people are now used to the internet and have the attention span of a gnat. But we have been told now for well over 100 years that technology was going to kill conversation. It was going to kill recordings. Were going to kill radio, which was, television was going to then kill radio. The internet was going to get rid of letter writing, and people are now sending emails. This urge to communicate, this urge to tell our stories is going to prevail. We might have different heroes, and I actually would love to see the next generation version of, who are the next heroes. It might not be cowboys. We're going to be, more and more with each generation removed from these periods. But who are the next heroes? Those stories are going to prevail because the stories are about us, and they're about people and our everyday lives, and whether we're conscious of it or not, we do talk in that mythic language. We do talk in the cautionary tales. And as somebody said, it just sucks you in. And I think that's why we're going to be listening to these songs for a long, long time.
Thank you, Millie. Scott Alarik, would you like to follow that?
Sure. There's a curious thing. Millie was mentioning boomers, and there's a curious thing happening in the folk music world today, at least around here, and I think it's probably mirrored nationally, where there's a young generation coming to the music in numbers that I think probably are unmatched, at least since the 1960s. Before the 60s folk revival, the first sign that there was something happening was not that stars started emerging. It was that campuses started having hootenannies and started having pickin' parties, and a lot of people got guitars and everybody wanted to sing together. It began as a social revival, and the first bands like the Kingston Trio that really capitalized on this emulated themselves after these campus ensembles. And right now, I did a story for the Globe recently about the rise of these neo-traditional string bands of young people, very young, hip, sophisticated, mostly urban people who are playing old-time Appalachian music in string bands. To kind of quantify it, because you can't, obviously, there's no point in checking the Billboard charts to find out if anything's happening there, I decided to call Deering Banjo, which is the largest maker of handmade banjos in the country. And the CEO, Janet Deering, told me that, picture this in the economic climate we're in right now, that they've had a 30% increase in business every year for the last 5 years. And then she was very quick to stress that Oh Brother kind of set it off the charts, but that they were seeing a steady rise for several years before that, particularly since they began marketing what they called a good time banjo, which was a banjo specifically designed for old time playing and for jamming, and made very affordably and durably for young people to be able to just, sling on their backs and go to a party or go traveling with. And there are a lot of but so what's happening, I don't know if you're familiar with the folk scene around Boston, but Boston has been known as the navel-gazing capital of the world for a long time in folk music. It's the sort of the epicenter of the brooding, introspective, pouting singer-songwriter, some of whom are, the best of whom are great and who I think are very much carrying on the tradition of the American folk song. But I don't mean to disparage them. But now all of a sudden it seems like the young people are the traditional singers, are the ones who love the old songs and the old ballads and who are rediscovering and reclaiming the old ballads and the old music. And it's the boomers who are the modern songwriter people. It's the older people who are the contemporary songwriter people, and the young people who are the traditional people. And I thought I would this is a little thing from the book of a young British folk singer, a wonderful ballad singer named Kate Rusby. And I think it picks up on what Millie was saying, because there's two kinds of authenticity. And I think for our generation, we saw the very real possibility that this music could perish. So there was a tremendous perceived need, and I think it was a real need, to try to keep these old styles of playing alive, to play old-time music or to sing the ballad in the way that it had been sung before. And in a very real way, while it did important work because it kept a lot of this music preserved, it also corrupted unintentionally the most dynamic and important facet of traditional music, of folk music, that separates from other kinds of music, which is that there is no fixed moment in the history of a ballad or a folk song. It's constantly changing. In fact, the only constant in tradition is change, so that a folk song never stops being written. It keeps growing and evolving and being taken into the lives and onto the tongues of new singers who bring it up from inside their experience and put that into it. That kind of authenticity, that kind of emotional authenticity, is what draws people like young singers like Kate Rusby. And here's a couple of the things she said about this new authenticity. She says, "I don't find any other form of music that has the effect that kind of breaks your heart like the old ballads do. I guess I just like to hear music that gets me upset and sad." That's a folky or what? The whole way they were written is so beautiful because it's people's music. It wasn't scholars writing it, so it's quite simple, but really captures what people went through. It's about people's emotions, about people falling in love and dying and leaving, and of course, those are all things we still do. What draws me, she says, is the authenticity of the feelings in the song, not how it might have been sung years ago. In order to get the song across, you have to find a way to feel it yourself, perhaps change it a bit so you really, really believe it yourself, or else how will it have an effect on other people when they hear it? You have to make it your own song.
Thanks, Scott. Folk music, of course, is also within the range of everybody. That is, its musical range is usually just a little bit over an octave, and the language of it is accessible and memorable, so that it's music that people can always learn and make. And now let's hear from Bill Nowlin of Rounder Records.
I just had a number of random thoughts here as people were talking. First of all, I wondered about what the purpose of a song actually is. And of course, there are many different purposes. Why do songs appeal to some of us and some other songs not appeal to us? Why do some songs appeal to some people but not to others? You mentioned, Greil, I think, you described a ballad as kind of a subversive form of communication in a way, and it tries to get under or around people's preconceptions maybe. And it made me think, is there a contrast then to the pure storytelling aspect of perhaps the griots in West Africa that would be the custodians of history of their group? They didn't have a written history, so they learned songs and they simply communicated genealogy, events that happened in the history of their people. That's not really subversive, that's straight communication. I don't know if that counts as a ballad, though. It's a form of communication. I know a couple of, we put out an album on Rounder some years ago from the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, and it appealed to me as a form of communication. The songs were recorded to folk melodies that were familiar to the Nicaraguan people, but they were songs that were meant to communicate to the guerrillas fighting in the mountains where they didn't have access to electronic communication. They were also talking to a lot of people that weren't literate. And the songs conveyed certain things like hygiene. Again, working with traditional melodies, but modern lyrics telling you that you need to wash your feet every day or two or you get jungle rot. Or telling you how to assemble or disassemble an M1 rifle, which was another form of communication and something else that the fighters needed to use. I'd heard of, but I've never heard yet, that there was a similar album put out in Mali at the time of their struggles against the French, again communicating sort of basics of basic forms of struggle. Millie, when you were talking about Louisiana and the hurricanes across the Gulf Coast, it made me think about event songs. I kind of doubt that there are going to be event songs that come out of these hurricanes that will become widely known throughout the country and will be around a generation or 3 generations from now. There's so many different forms of communication today that I wonder if this one form of communication that we're looking at now that has worked very effectively in the past is gone. I don't know. I have to disagree with Bob Dylan in one sense that there is a value to preserving some of these and protecting some of these things that we have. Of course, I'd have to think that because I work in the business of recording things, and but that's one of the reasons I do it. Event songs aren't introspective. They tell a story about something that happened. Maybe over time they become more and more interesting and they take on a less specific this happened and that happened, and they become to have a broader appeal than just a historical thing. And the last thing I thought about in just a couple notes I jotted to myself here is, well, why did this appeal to me? In particular, why did ballads and folk music appeal to me? I grew up in the area here. I used to see Joan Baez sing at the Club 47. I grew up in the suburbs. So I was born in Jamaica Plain, but I grew up in the suburbs in Lexington. And one of the things about folk music that first appealed to me was a sense of authenticity, maybe against the, it's kind of a routine thing to say now about the conformity of the 50s, but there might have been something to the gray flannel suit and my lack of interest in becoming a bank teller and falling into whatever patterns there were at the time. No disrespect to any bank tellers in the audience. That was a life I saw for myself as a possibility at one point, but it didn't work out that way. There was a certain kind of romance to it, too. I imagined myself sitting on the back porch of a mountain in West Virginia someplace. I think we grew up, many of us, as in a television generation. Movies appealed to us, so I was able to vicariously put myself in those shoes. I can't play the banjo. I wish I could, but that's what I'd like to be doing. For 40 years now, I've be my lifetime goal to sit on the back porch looking over the holler and playing the banjo. There's just an appeal that endures to this day, and that may be something why young people today, a certain form of young people, a certain subset of young people, why there is that appeal because of the authenticity and maybe even the romance of it. I also thought about urban youths and rap music. That conveys at least an attitude. I think it also conveys information. I think it also conveys stories of one kind or another. And I think it's interesting that that spread way beyond urban environments to become a very popular music with suburban white youth, another subset of the population. I think we're going to have a lot of different kinds of music going on simultaneously. That's enough for now.
Thank you, Bill Nowlin. I actually wanted to ask you a question. It's related to what Scott said about the banjo's sales and the way Oh Brother and maybe Songcatcher, these films recently have been appealing to a folk audience. And that is, I wonder what what sales are like at Rounder. Is your business booming? Are you doing better than?
Business goes up and down, and we've seen cycles. I used to think, and I think it was true, that when popular music became more boring, when there wasn't anything exciting happening in popular music, and that's kind of been true for several years now, sales would go up for us because people would look for alternatives, and they'd look for something that felt a little more real to them. The last 3 years, this year hasn't been an especially good year, but the 3 years before that were 3 of the best years that we had. Some of that, I think, did come out of Oh Brother, which set off bluegrass music. Even though there's no bluegrass in Oh Brother, everybody thought it was bluegrass music, and so bluegrass sales took off at a dramatic pace. This year's, depends on who you've got albums by and how they go over. You never know what's going to happen. I feel okay about the history looking forward. Everybody in the music business was very worried about digital downloads and what they were going to do. Would people simply stop buying records because they could get it for free? We find now that if it's made available, at least in the short run, the next few years anyhow, if it's made available in good quality and relatively inexpensively, an awful lot of people will buy it. And in the very first 12 months of iTunes, we've done more business in digital downloads than our entire mail order company. Wow. Which had been 30-some years in the making, building up mailing lists and so forth. It also allows the music to get to all kinds of places where you can't find many of our records in normal record stores anymore. Now there are other ways to find it in places where there's no record store for hundreds of miles around.
There was an article that Kenny Goldstein wrote in 1979 called The Technology of the Recording Industry, in which he claimed that every new technological advance brought with it a folk revival, starting with the invention of printing and the broadside, and then chapbooks and engraving and recording, and now what you're talking about, this kind of possibility of downloading. I think it's probably true.
Let me just add one thing about that, actually, because it's a fact that impressed itself on my consciousness a couple months ago. we look at most businesses, I didn't even know what an invoice was when we started, but I learned. Most businesses look at market share. You try to figure out your place in the industry. Our market share in the digital side of the music industry is double what our market share is in the mainstream recorded sound, right on CDs. Somehow, the kind of music that we present, you can't actually do this mathematically, but it's as though the kind of music we present is twice as interesting to the people that download music as getting recorded sound is.
And I'd like to just add.
This is Scott Alarik speaking now.
I'd like to add, just for context, and what Bill was saying about Rounder, that during the 3 years that you had the best year of your history for 3 years in a row, right? Each year was the best year they'd ever had, and then the next year was better, and then better. That during that, the mainstream music industry was at the tail end of a 5-year historic decline, in which, in one 5-year period, the size of the mainstream music industry declined by 30%. And Rounder, during that time, is having record years, year after year after year.
Very, interesting. You're listening to Sean Wilentz and Greil Marcus discussing The Rose and the Briar. We've got another remark here from Sean.
I wanted to be an optimist on what revivals are about, but I think I have a different take on what revivals are and what authenticity is. If authenticity gets equated with merely preservation, I don't mean to put preservation down, but I'm saying if it's only preservation, if it's limited to preservation, then we're in trouble. I think that's what Bob Dylan was talking about. This music is too hard, it's too rough, it's too weird. He said, look, you have roses and briars growing out of people's breasts. That's really strange. It's one of the strangest images I've ever seen, ever heard. One of the things about the old music when I buy my Rounder records is it's weird. It's truly strange. We can't write that music today. We don't write that music today. So the revival is not simply preserving something that's old and past. It's preserving something that's future. It's preserving something that is so strange that we can't imagine it anymore, yet once we hear it, we can. So the authenticity part is about reviving something that it's not even dead. It's not dead. It doesn't have to be revived. It's beyond us. The second point is the more obvious one, that of course we remake it all the time. Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll is a sort of a story song, but it's sort of not a story song, and it's not that old. And the difference was that he didn't try to just tell a story. Bob Dylan was never a topical singer, as he put it, or he tried to be something more than that. And I don't think that that's ever going to stop, that kind of reviving.
Well, as the folklorist in the panel,
Millie Rahn.
authenticity is, yes, I'm Millie, one of the things that we talk about a lot. And certainly more recent folklorists like myself are very much not in the mold of the folklorist that some of the people in this book have written about. We all have the images of Francis James Child across the street, in his study, in the 19th century at Harvard teaching and sending around the world for manuscripts. And then we have Cecil Sharp going to the Southern Mountains and, sitting there and taking down all the words and things like that. I have a rap on this that I give every year at this time of year to my family about tradition and authenticity. And it works for songs, it works for holidays, it works for calendar customs, family events. If the tradition starts to feel like a burden and it no longer has any meaning, change the tradition. Otherwise, you are preserving a museum piece that has nothing. It's not going to go anywhere because it's going to die out. It doesn't mean anything. When we are hearing these songs by younger people or different versions, when I was in folklore school in Newfoundland, which some would argue there was never a folk revival there because the tradition never declined. It constantly changed and grew. But one of my professors was a Scotsman from Aberdeen, and he was even trying to make the point of, remember, these songs originally were passed on orally within a community, people who lived together, who worked together, families. They were told to preserve cultural knowledge, but also to entertain themselves. And he was saying, you don't even use the word variant or version, because this came out of oral tradition. And the minute you use variant or version, you are saying, you know, there is this version, and then if somebody changes a word or, you know, changes the character, but you're saying that in the tradition that there is this one true text, and then everything else departs from that. Well, if it came out of the oral tradition, there is not that one true text, and that's why we are still talking about these songs now, I think, and why we still hear them and why they still appeal, because there's something that we all bring to it, that it's weird, but it's why we read books, it's why we listen to music, it's why we, you know, paint pictures. It's that mythic quality to life, or the mysterious quality of life that Greil was mentioning.
Well, to build up on that, this is
Greil
Greil
Marcus.
And something that was said a few minutes ago about doubting that the flood of this year would be something that would find its form in ballads or in songs as the flood of 1927 did. One of the great mysteries of ballads for me, and it's a mystery that in many ways this book takes up and certainly doesn't solve or answer, is why certain events turn into songs that are sung for decades and for generations, and why other events that on paper seem just as dramatic, just as striking, don't survive that way. Cecil Brown is a novelist and anthropologist, and in The Rose and the Briar he wrote about two songs that were based on real events that have been tracked down and reconstructed to their very last detail. One is the Stagger Lee Ballad, which is about a murder that took place in St. Louis in 1895, and the other is Frankie and Albert, or Frankie and Johnny, which is about a killing that took place in St. Louis in 1899. And those songs have been sung for over 100 years by thousands of different people. They've been recorded hundreds of times in countless different versions. And they relate events that on their face seem ordinary. Lovers quarrel, bang, bang. People arguing over a gambling debt in a saloon, bang, bang. And so what? Why do these songs strike people in a way that they want to enter the story and they want to keep telling it? The same goes for the flood of 1927. It created hundreds and hundreds of songs, some of them commercial, written in New York City, some of them composed in the South. Well, I began to wonder while we were talking tonight if it might be true that some of the ballads that we consider authorless, that we consider that are put together out of feelings and instincts and the desire to tell a story, or maybe to sell broadsheets on the street before people were selling records. What if songs like The Unfortunate Rake, what if that song really was based on a real incident? Maybe it was something that somebody who liked to write songs had heard about. Did you hear about this guy? You know, everybody was passing him on the street, and he was just lying there dying and trying to get people to listen to him. And did you hear about that? And from that, you know, someone would create a story. And then it mutates when that song comes to the United States, and it splits. The story of the syphilitic sailor, the syphilitic soldier, The Unfortunate Rake, it splits racially. In Black America, it becomes St. James Infirmary, where a man is called to the infirmary to see his dead lover. And for white people, it becomes the streets of Laredo with a cowboy dying in the street. Well, you know, we see these as traditional songs that don't have authors, but there's no reason to think that those variants, too, weren't based on real events. Maybe didn't happen to the person who wrote or sang the first version of the song, maybe something somebody heard about. And the way that song then mutates into the present, St. James Infirmary itself turns into James Alley Blues, which is a recording made in New Orleans in 1927 by a singer named Rabbit Brown. Uses the same cadence, uses the same sense of doom, although in many ways it's a comic song. And then James Alley Blues and St. James Infirmary turn into Bob Dylan's 1983 song Blind Willie McTell, which is about a real person, except there was a person named Blind Willie McTell. He was a blues singer, and yet the real person is not in this song. He functions solely as a symbol. He functions as someone who you can never rise to his level. You can never communicate as he did. He represents what you can never touch, what you can never reach. And that song goes back to the racial divide of the unfortunate rake when it comes to this country. It's about slavery. It's about sin. It's about crime. And it's about how somehow a song can pay for those crimes. So not only does the ballad tradition constantly mutate, but I think there may be real events behind all of them. Once you reconstruct the Staggerly story, and I won't take up more time by regaling you with all the details, you find that it's infinitely complex, that it brings together themes you would never suspect had anything to do with two guys arguing in a saloon. And maybe the tremendously dramatic real-life story that lies behind the song had nothing at all to do with why it somehow caught the imagination of people over a century. Or maybe it does.
You're listening to Greil Marcus and Sean Wilentz discussing The Rose and the Briar at the Cambridge Forum. Why don't we now turn this program over to the audience and get some questions from the floor? Is there anybody got anything to ask? Aha. This is your big chance. Say your name.
No, actually, at the Cambridge Forum, we believe in anonymity except for the speakers.
Oh.
So I don't have to say my name. But that is our tradition. We do, unlike many forums, we don't ask speakers to identify themselves. I have many, many questions, and I will restrain myself. But I did want to go back to this idea of the modern ballad and authorship versus anonymity. And I will take the thoughts of anybody who is willing to share them. Clearly, all those ballads written by anonymous going back several centuries have been sung and performed and worked over by many, many different authors. And they're filled with commonplaces, and somehow they manage to put those commonplaces together in a unique and interesting way. The commonplaces serve a variety of functions. They make them memorable. They make them, easier to pass on. But they also are very vivid, and which is presumably why they've survived. But a modern ballad or a modern song that might eventually be worked over and become a ballad with a known author and a known provenance doesn't have that advantage of time and mining and sort of creating a diamond with pressure and suffering. So what can a modern singer-songwriter do to make something that's a credible ballad, a memorable ballad? What kind of twist, what kind of effort has been successful in modern times?
Oh, sorry.
Millie Rahn.
I was going to put the... Yes, we'll all go down the line. I talk about this, and certainly from the local angle, think about Alice's Restaurant, which Arlo Guthrie wrote in 1965. It was... The record came out in 1967. Now, that song, we know who wrote it, we know who recorded it, we know the story. It is now on practically every radio station on Thanksgiving, and it means it's noon, in many places play it at noon. It's now, and there was a comic strip at Thanksgiving, and this guy was saying, okay, Mom, we will arrive at noon, but we're not getting out of the car until 12:18 because Alice's Restaurant is 18 minutes. But here's a song. Is it about, some hippies out in western Massachusetts who dump garbage, on one of the most sacred holidays in American history that we still celebrate, which came out of a much longer tradition of harvest homes and days of Thanksgiving and all of that? Or is it was in the middle of the 60s, it was the middle of the Vietnam War. A lot of people were very upset about what was going on. We still play it, and I find it amazing, actually, now in 2005, when the song's been around for so long and we're in a very similar situation. And it speaks to us because it has taken those elements of humor and personal experience, and we're pissed off with our government and things, many people are, and it's fun at the same time. It resonates on so many levels. I mean, that's just kind of, to me, the archetypal song also because it has so many connections right here to Cambridge as well. Sorry, Sean.
I think on the question of modernity and anonymity, I think we should wait a while. One of the points of Cecil Brown's piece in the book about Frankie and Johnny, or Frankie and Albert, that's a song I assume you've all heard. It's recorded by everybody from Mississippi John Hurt to Guy Lombardo, right? There are innumerable versions. But it was written by a person named Bill Dooley in St. Louis, right, who was there, and the night it happened, or the night after, he had that song knocked out. Now, we have forgotten that song was written by someone, but it was. It took an artist to do that, and that's really one of the points of Cecil's very rich piece in the book. So we often forget the things that are actually, we imagine them as being, from time immemorial or somehow made up by some magical folk process, in fact had an author. And this really speaks to, I think, what Greil was saying before, if there's an event for all of these things, there's an author too.
Another way to respond to this is to look at Bruce Springsteen's song Nebraska, which in The Rose and the Briar is written about by Howard Hampton, who's a critic from California. And Nebraska is about Charles Starkweather and Carol Fugate and the murder spree that they went on in 1958 and 1959, and starting in Lincoln, Nebraska, and ending in Wyoming, where 10 people were murdered, starting with Carol Fugate's parents and baby sister or brother, I can't remember, I think brother. In any case, when Bruce Springsteen came to write this song in, I think, 1982, it had already entered American culture. It had already been the subject of Terrence Malick's film Badlands. It had been an enormous news story in the 1950s, and it was just burned into the consciousness of anyone who was old enough to read the papers at that time. It's also been the subject of the movie Natural Born Killers, which is based on those same events. So Bruce Springsteen, when he sat down to write this ballad, already had all different kinds of what are called media representations to draw on. You could say that this event was maybe less real to him as something that actually happened than as a story that had been passed down. Now, to write the ballad, he went back and he read books on the event, and he put actual dialogue that was spoken by the real-life protagonists in this story into his song. But what Howard Hampton does when he writes about this song, he also brings in Jack Kerouac on the road, where nobody gets killed, and he essentially implies that maybe that's a weakness of the book. Maybe that's part of what's phony about this very mythical book, which is a novel after all and is not, anybody's journal. He brings in Robert Frank's The Americans, which is a travelogue of the United States in the late 40s and early 50s, with a lot of death, in particular death on the highway or highways. He brings in Sullivan's Travels, the movie that Oh Brother, Where Art Thou was ultimately inspired by a movie from, I think, 1941 or 42. And what he's saying is that it's there for the taking. It depends on your talent, on your obsessions, on your compulsions to reach out into the culture and find the stories that either already are there or that are waiting to be given their true form, but haven't yet. And in fact, Terrence Malick's Badlands is considered by film critics an absolute masterpiece, and Terrence Malick is an unfathomable genius, mainly because he only makes a movie every 20 years and never talks to anybody. But in fact, it's completely inferior to the Springsteen song. It doesn't come close in terms of getting inside people. In 4 or 5 minutes, Bruce Springsteen is able to bring characters to life in a way that Terrence Malick wasn't able to in 2 hours.
I'd like to
Scott Alarik.
take a whack at this just in a bit of a historical perspective. Francis Child, who was referred to earlier, a Harvard professor who was seeking to collect in the 19th century whatever remnants there were of the original ballad tradition in England and Scotland, the pre-literate ballad tradition, when ballads were the principal form of literature for people, and he came to his collection became so definitive that its 305 entrants are still referred to as child ballads, which is something that would mortify the old professor. I can tell you, he was a great believer in the scholar being behind the scholarship, but he became a fierce critic of what was known in the 1800s as the romantic theory of the ballad. Bad name for what it was. It was really an attempt to try to explain how the lower classes of humanity could be responsible for creating the greatest works of genius in a civilization. And there was this theory, much advanced by a lot of elite scholars, that somehow ballads were created collectively. Sort of the monkeys with typewriters kind of theory. And if there was an agenda to Child's collection beyond trying to just gather whatever could still be gathered together, he and the other English scholars he worked with were very determined to debunk the romantic theory, and he became very outspoken in his belief that ballads, as he put it, he had such a meticulous way of speaking as a scholar. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he said there is no reason to believe that ballads are created in any other way than all works of great art are known to be created, and that is by a single author, by a single creator. However, what they benefit from then, which is unlike any other form of art or literature we have in our culture, unlike anything else, and what makes them so unique, is that they then go into the lives of all these other people. And he likened it to a stone in the middle of a brook over ages, being washed over by this water until it becomes perfect and reaches a state of such natural organic perfection that it doesn't change anymore. But the ballads, sort of what Millie was saying, is that there is no known original source to a folk ballad or a traditional folk song. So they keep being rewritten all the time, and they in a sense, they're all variants. And that's something that modern technology, beginning with the printing press, is a process that it's chipped away at and that doesn't exist anymore. So somebody like Bob Dylan or Bruce Springsteen can write a ballad that belongs in the company of the great ballads, but everybody who comes across it from then on is going to sing it pretty much the same way it was written. They have access to the original source. So that tremendous creative force that is tradition is, as far as I can tell, is just something we're going to have to miss. Now, the good news is we know who wrote Blowin' in the Wind, and we know who wrote Nebraska, and we can greatly deepen our appreciation of that art by knowing something about the creator. And wouldn't we love to know who wrote Barbara Allen? Wouldn't you love to, Greil, to be able to ask some of the questions you were asking before? Was there a real event? Did a cowboy get shot in Laredo? Please, somebody tell me. We can't know. We'll never know. So, like all things with progress, there's a trade. But that great mystical creative process of tradition, I think, is something that belongs to the past.
But don't you think that some of these written, known ballads do enter tradition? I mean, Ewan MacColl wrote ballads for his radio ballads,
yes,
entered tradition. People forgot who wrote them. They spread, and people then.
But they don't. What they don't do is they don't enter in as liquid. They don't enter in this perpetual state of creative change. Everybody who sings them pretty much the same way.
Not if they forget. Not if they forget who wrote them. I mean, sometimes they enter in and people forget.
But even the tradition like that, I think, is a very different organism today, in that people have radios, people have records, and people go to source material. So that creative process. I remember once getting into an argument, a delightful argument, very late at night with Jerry Jeff Walker, where I was trying to convince him that Mr. Bojangles was a folk song for much the same reason that you're saying. Not because it became a big hit and everybody knew it, but because there was a period when it was traveling more from saloon to saloon and folk singer to folk singer than it was traveling through the radio airwaves and everything. And Jerry Jeff said to me, but it's always in New Orleans. The guy's name is always Mr. Bojangles. You know, it doesn't change the way a lot of those songs we were.
Barbara Allen always has a rose growing out of.
I think a lot of Americans suspect that Mr. Bojangles is written by Sammy Davis Jr.
Yes, yes.
So I think that there's an instability of the identity, which, but I think you're right. I mean, look. Things are different. We're not in the 16th century anymore, so that's a given. But when Jason and the Scorchers do a Bob Dylan song, it's not a Bob Dylan song like Bob Dylan would do a Bob Dylan song.
But it's recognizable as a Bob Dylan song.
Really?
Yes, it is.
Sometimes it's not. Not all the time.
Every song. I was going to mention a vignette a week and a half ago.
Nowlin.
It's Bill Nowlin. I was listening to Hillbilly at Harvard, and they played a song that Bob Dylan wrote called "Only a Hobo" by a bluegrass group. And then the hosts had a discussion afterwards, and they said, it says here on the record that Bob Dylan wrote this. How can he claim to have written this song? It sounded like such a classic ballad or traditional song, really.
He took the tune, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've got another question here.
Oh, well, I will yield the microphone then.
I'm so glad you mentioned Hillbilly at Harvard. That's one of the highlights of our Saturday mornings from 9 to 1. And but it's interesting. Almost every week they play either Hank Williams or the Carter Family. And they seem to be it's just constant background that they. But I remember when I was in the college in the 40s, the two ballads we sang was the Titanic and Detour. And they still go through my head. It's great, great songs. By the way, Scott, I hope you're on Hillbilly at Harvard sometime. Love to hear you there. It was a good job.
Thank you very much.
What is Detour?
I don't know who did it first. The version I knew of it was Ramblin' Jack Elliott. Did a tremendous version of it.
I'd love to say it, but I won't.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think this might be a case where we have to wait. I mean, give us another generation, and we know who Bruce Springsteen is or Bob Dylan, but, 2 or 3 generations down the line, we won't necessarily know or why they're important. I mean, it's kind of like, why do we care?
I don't mean to suggest that great
Scott
ballads
Alarik.
aren't being written, or that they won't continue to be written, and that great songs will not continue to enter the bloodstream of the people. There's just an aspect of that rubbing smooth process that there isn't that sort of free collective ownership and collective creativity of a song that exists anymore. Nobody would get too far along with Nebraska before somebody would say to them, hey, you know, that's a Bruce Springsteen song, and the singer would say, oh, really? And go back and hear it and set the ship right again.
But see, that's the ultimate compliment, I would say, to what makes a folk song, when it enters tradition and that it's speaking to somebody. Mm-hmm. And, you know, if you scratch all of these stories, if you scratch every legend, I really believe there is a grain of truth there. There is the cowboy. There is, you know, the doomed lovers, the highway shooter, and the nation's lost and found. We love these quirky characters in our culture.
Let's take another question.
Thank you. Some of you have, spoken rather optimistically about the fact that this sort of, folk tradition is continuing to live, despite the changes in technology and such. And this brings up something that had been running through my mind. I'd like to hear some various thoughts on copyright, not just the law, but the culture of copyright. That, I think, Millie, it was you who mentioned that if you're going to tell a story, or you have to make it your own, and you have to really, that was the thing you quoted, wasn't it? You have to make it your own, and you have to really believe it. And maybe you take the song that's, about an event in general, and you add a verse that makes it about your town in particular, and I'd just like to hear some I'd like to hear some optimism about how we can continue to have this when there's, this great, I think the folk today have a fear of touching things because they belong to someone else. They belong to the creator, and they, it's the copyright issue, and it's the, the idea of professionalism, that only professionals can create music, can create art. And how do we, the folk tradition comes out of each and every person.
The things that are hundreds of years old now have been copyrighted by individuals, some of whom you may have heard of, like Rayek, some of whom you've never heard of before. It doesn't stop people from singing them. It really doesn't. I mean, it's a commercial problem. I mean, if you're going to get a clearance for it, for a CD, or if it's going to be on the radio, I suppose, that's, people do it because they want to get a cut of somebody else's work. It's called theft. But still the songs are sung around campfires from here to, Zimbabwe. So they're going to be sung, they're going to be there. There's just so much people can do. It's part of modern life.
You can copyright an arrangement, but not the song.
I think people are afraid of it, though. I'm on an email list for musicians, and the amateurs are so afraid that they can't go out and play in public, or they can't make recordings of themselves because they don't understand the laws, and they have this idea that copyright is something very important, and I sense that it's holding people back from churning things over.
That's terrible. That's really too bad.
Copyright is a double-edged sword. It's meant to protect the creative accomplishments of a person that writes something so that they can benefit from them for a limited period of time. It's not so limited anymore, though. The limit keeps getting pushed back and back and back. It was 27 years, and you could renew it for 27. Then it became 50 years, and then it became 75 years after the person died. It goes on forever. It's meant to be a public trust, though. This is a privilege that's granted to people to own this by the government. I mean, the notion behind it all is a good one, which is that everything belongs to everybody, but for a limited period of time, you can benefit from your original creativity. The problem is it keeps getting pushed back and back and back. And if you wanted to put out some recordings from the 1920s that were recorded for, let's say, Columbia Records, as a CD to accompany the book, you shouldn't have to ask Columbia's permission to do that anymore if it is something they have kept away from the public for more than 50 years. They've got it in a vault someplace. They will ask to be paid on it, and nobody's pushed the case yet, but there's a good case that could be made that if you're given a public trust and you abuse it by holding something back, that it should therefore be thrown into the public domain. People should just take a chance in say, well, you're talking about public performance of songs that might be variants of a song you've heard from somebody else. You should push the limits a little bit. And I don't think there's too much to worry about most of the time.
I'd just like to add real quickly. I think what your concerns were with your question is one of the things that's really drawing a lot of young people to traditional music today, when they understand how unlike other forms of art this is, and that it is commonly owned. It's owned by everybody. And you mean we can play with this stuff? We can roll in it and get dirt all over our hands. This is our own universal sandbox. And it's free of all of those things, free of all of those hassles of modern culture. Here is just this great collective ownership and this great community that's created not only with the musicians today, but with the musicians who came before. And that's, of course, the great magic and wonder of the tradition.
Another question.
Now, I enjoyed hearing Scott sing Barbara Allen in the Streets of Laredo. I don't know that I would have enjoyed it as much if you had recited the Streets of Laredo or Barbara Allen. And I'm sure I could find more people out there who could hum the Streets of Laredo than recite the words. And I actually owned the 5-volume set of the child ballads. They make terrible reading just as entertainment. So what about the music? How important is the musical piece to the survival of ballads? And are the tunes locked to them, or do they diverge? And how is it the tunes seem to have their own existence?
Well, great question.
There's an easy way to answer that question.
Marcus.
I would have thought up until last week that obviously music adds so many dimensions to the ordinary and makes the most banal sentiment seem transcendent and unique. That takes a soap opera situation and makes it seem as if it is both part of your experience and somehow beyond it. And we all go back to the folklorists who were first collecting songs, and they did not collect the melodies. They did not collect anything about rhythms. They only wanted the words. And it wasn't until in the 1920s and 30s that folklorists began to bring that together too. Cecil Sharp was making recordings, but he was mainly interested in getting the words down and the different variants from county to county. But I heard the other day a recording by Garth and Maud Hudson, Garth Hudson of the band and his wife Maud. And it's a live recording of all different sorts of songs and pieces. And Maud Hudson is not really a singer. With the right piece, she can invest her physicality into it and make it seem as if you're listening to a singer. But when she did Blind Willie McTell, she clearly could not come close to singing that song. So instead, she recited it as if it were the Raven. It's done exactly like we all did the Raven in 5th or 6th grade, and boy, did it work. It was just remarkable. So in fact, when you said that, I thought, well, I would have liked to have heard Scott recite that. I've never heard anybody recite Barbara Allen. I wonder.
Well, yeah, if you had Garth Hudson backing him up.
Actually, Cecil Sharp was a composer and the head of a musical conservatory, and he could take down notation, and he did notate. But what's complicated about that issue is how to notate the tunes that you're hearing. And that is a really vexed issue for musicologists. The best person was probably Ruth Crawford Seeger herself, who listened to the entire Lomax archive and managed to notate, especially for a book called Our Singing Country, the songs that the Lomax has collected. And it's very interesting to listen to the field recordings, many of which are on Rounder Records, of the Lomax recordings, and look at Ruth Crawford Seeger's notations in Our Singing Country and see the difficulty that anybody would have notating some of those slides and whoops and grace notes and changes in rhythms and so on. But it's really, that is a real science.
I think as a singer, of course, I think what you're getting at is what the melodies add, and it's almost as if the emotional DNA behind the song is encoded into it, so that you have not just meaning, but the emotion of the singer, the mood of the song. I think there are probably a lot of songs that, set to different melodies, could seem like entirely different songs. So, and that's one of the, I think for all of us, one of the most powerful things about traditional songs is that part of the song never dies, and so it's really as if our ancestors are talking to us. I remember Eliza Carthy, the great British traditional singer, Martin Carthy and Norma Watterson's child, saying it was almost as if our ancestors were whispering in our ears, not only about how they saw the world around them, but how they felt about the lives that they led.
I talked a moment ago about attitude in music, and there's a lot more than melody and lyric, too. There can be just the intonation or the attitude. A lot of the pop music that I heard when I was growing up in the 50s or the 60s, I didn't even know what they were saying, but it really appealed to me, and we, of course, spent time trying to figure out what was that word? There are whole songs like Louie Louie that, people still don't know what they said, as far as I know.
And I think I was going to,
Millie Rahn.
You really get into now aesthetics, and that is another cultural product. There are a lot of traditions where people do recite the last few lines of a song, or again, in Newfoundland, men, because men were the only ones who performed in public until my generation, I was supposed to, they would hold hands, and together they would recite the last stanza or the last couple lines of a song. Mm-hmm. But I think what you're getting into, too, is, think about in my household, my husband's a Bostonian, he can't stand to hear Hank Williams. And, somebody was talking about Hank Williams. Well, it's kind of, he's Hank Williams, he's Saint Hank, and it depends on the aesthetics, it depends on the region. Again, somebody else could sing the same song and make it pretty or make it much more authentic and sing it in an Appalachian style or sing it in an unaccompanied Scottish Highland version. Again, it goes back to what we bring to the song. It's very much a partnership, what we bring to it as well as what the artist or the singer is trying to communicate to us.
If you're talking about traditional ballads, there are fewer tunes than there are texts, and traditional singers swap them around. They sometimes don't like this particular tune, so they take another one. And so you hear the same tune being sung to different sets of words because they scan similarly. Another question, yeah.
Hi. I beg your forbearance for getting off point a little bit here, but I'm...
There's been a point?
I wonder what you folks think about popular music these days and how it seems to be pretty kind of emasculated politically, that there doesn't seem to be any kind of protest as there was, if I'm correct, in the 60s during the folk revival then. There seems to be plenty of opportunity to things to complain about, but there's not much complaining going on.
I think that was only a limited period of time, though, that there was explicit protest music that went past a certain point. Looking at the history of music such as I know of it, that was a rare moment in time for relatively few years. I don't know why it doesn't continue. Certainly individual songwriters today have a lot to say about things. Getting to the popular level is another story. I wouldn't come up with a conspiracy theory to say it's squelched. I just don't think it quite gets there.
Anybody else?
Well, I would look at
Millie Rahn.
Louisiana in 1927, and if that's not a protest song, in the context that it was used, when it was on radio stations, it was on NPR, it was, the lyrics were printed in newspapers and magazines just a couple months ago. Again, it's not a literal interpretation, but that's what so many of these songs were. They're about injustice. They're about, life is not fair. And a lot of songs that we kind of, tap our foot to when you really listen to the words, and that has been, I think, a constant all throughout the history of human communication through songs and ballads.
There's also another thing.
Greil Marcus.
And that is that in the 1960s, protest songs were, among other things, a fad. And they were something that suddenly seemed like the only way to write a really good song, and that's what happens in a fad. Suddenly, all kinds of things no longer make sense. They don't sound right, but only a certain thing does. It's just like when shoulder pads were introduced for women's clothing, really huge shoulder pads. Within about a year, you couldn't. It just didn't look right if people weren't wearing shoulder pads, and 2 years later it looked totally bizarre. And that's what happens with fads. There's also the fact that because it was a fad and because some protest songs sold well, everybody wanted to make one because it was a good way to get on the radio. Randy Newman wrote a song about the first Iraq War called Lines in the Sand. It was serviced only to radio stations, and they didn't play it. The Rolling Stones have a song denouncing the present Iraq War on their new album, and nobody's playing it. But there are, in fact, many, many political songs in country music over the last several years, all, not all, but almost all, wildly in favor of the war, and essentially, let's go over there and kick some ass. And those songs are immensely popular.
And they did get on the radio.
And they did get on the radio. Right.
Well, there's some anti-war country songs too. Not as many, but there are some. And I don't think it's ever stopped. I mean, Barry McGuire killed a certain kind of protest song.
This whole crazy world is just too frustrating.
Right.
This was a catalog of everything.
Right.
And, there was nothing left to say. My mom doesn't like me. Well,
Well, actually, people do write a lot of those songs too, but that's another. But that was a certain style. See, and it's just and when it gets into Bob Dylan. Let's forget about that. But there was a thing that became known as protest music, that was brilliantly captured by the National Lampoon in 1969 or thereabouts. Where they had an imitation of Bob Dylan, right, saying remember the fabulous 60s, the beans, the protests, the marches, the breath cupboards, and best of all, the music. And it was supposed to be a replay for an album you can buy late at night on the cable stations. That was done. That was already being parodied in 1969. But that was a specific kind of thing. And I think that I know my son asked me the same question. He's 25, and he asked me the same question: why isn't there more protest music? Because I think in his mind, he still thinks that that's all that it is. It's a specific genre that only lasted a little while. But, Born in the USA is a protest song, which then Ronald Reagan tried to take up, and then Bruce Springsteen had to, wrench it back. And so I don't think that has ever really ended.
I've heard protest songs sung in folk groups, people sitting around the living room, people have, written them and so on.
There's lots of political music. There's lots of political songwriters, and most of the best songwriters, I think, are quite political in their approach, even to very personal songs. What was weird about the '60s, as Bill was saying, is that it got on the radio for that brief period of time. But this goes back historically. It's not anything particularly new. The Weavers sacrificed their political identity to get their folk songs on the radio. And they argued a lot about whether they should do it, but they did it, and they knew that was the price they were going to pay. The blues guys, this is why double entendres and metaphors were invented by the folks, so that they could talk exactly about the way they wanted to about the ruling class and not get hung. So it's a long process in our musical history.
Another question, last question.
Thank you for your remarkable insights. I wanted to ask you about a couple of specific songs by asking this question in the spirit of Robert Pinsky's America's Favorite Poetry or Poem Project. I wondered if you all would say perhaps what your favorite American folk ballad is and why, or perhaps your favorite performance of a folk ballad, given that you have such amazing collective experience of having seen folk music performed over a decade or so, but maybe just individual folk songs that have inspired you.
Scott, would you dare to name your favorite folks ballad?
I need to think about it a little bit.
Yeah. Anybody?
Somebody else must be.
That's a hard one.
All right, well,
Greil Marcus.
you can't answer that question, because if you ask that question every 5 minutes, there will be a different answer for anyone who really loves music. But this minute, my favorite folk song is called My Sister's Tiny Hands by the Hanson Family. And it's a ballad about fraternal twins, a boy and a girl, who were wrapped around each other in the womb and who were absolutely inseparable all through childhood and adolescence. And then one day when they were walking through a swamp, the sister was bitten by a snake. This goes back to Springfield Mountain, one of the first truly indigenous American folk songs that really went everywhere in the 18th century. She's bitten by a snake and she dies. And the brother goes insane, and he spends the rest of his life wading through swamps, forests, deserts, killing snakes. And that's all he does.
Thanks to our speakers. Thank you, Sean Wilentz. Thank you, Greil Marcus. Thanks to our panelists, Scott Alarik, Millie Rahn, Bill Nowlin. You have been listening to a program of Cambridge Forum recorded in December 2005, co-sponsored by the First Parish in Cambridge Unitarian Universalist, the Lowell Institute, and Friends of Cambridge Forum. For more information about this radio program entitled The Rose and the Briar, featuring Sean Wilentz and Greil Marcus with Scott Alarik, Millie Rahn, and Bill Nowlin, or about our ongoing radio series, visit us on the web at www.cambridgeforum.org. In Harvard Square, I'm Ruth Perry. Thanks for joining us.